Hey, family. Once again, it's Motivational Monday, and today I am sharing with you some of my interview that I had with Reverend Dr. Chris Conti. He is not only a medical physician, but he is a pastor. And so he has an interesting perspective that he's been sharing with us. And the next question that I asked him was about our green status that takes effect this Friday here in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it may be different where you are. You may already be in a green status, or you may be getting ready to go, but the country is getting ready to open back up. And many people have been speculating, been asking questions, been feeling uncertainty. This man of God, this physician, has a perspective that I believe everyone needs to hear. If you're a pastor, if you're a leader, if you're a member of a church, if you're just going outside, you need to hear this perspective. Reverend Dr. Chris Conti talk about the green status right here on Motivational Monday. This green status, what does that mean for everybody? Because as you were talking about church and spaces, I was thinking about even, employment, restaurants. There are like salons and barbershops are opening up. I'm in dire need of a haircut right now. That's why I've been wearing this hat.
Man, I hear you.
But what does that mean for us when it says green? So, because I think everybody thinks that, oh, we're clear, we're good to go, everything is back to normal.
So the status, the color status, is based on the public health information and what we call the epidemiologic data. So what that means is that we determine color based on the number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths over a geographic area within a group of a population. And once we reach certain thresholds of numbers, that's what determines the phase, the color phase that we're in. So to be in green, we have to meet certain criteria about the number of new cases, the number of new hospitalizations, and the number of deaths. And so once you meet that threshold, then just epidemiologically, you can meet that color threshold, and that's how the color changes. The restrictions and guidance for those colors are then based on the Centers for Disease Control, World Health Organization, and local or state and local public health information. And so in green, it's assumed that the number of cases has reached such a small level that the risk of transmission, if we begin to regather, is believed to be low, which is a little interesting because we still don't know how many people are positive. If 9 out of 10 people haven't even been tested, and 30% of the people who have been tested could still be what we call either asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, meaning they'll never have symptoms or they'll develop symptoms very late. And then another 30+% could be walking around under the impression that they're negative when in fact that they're not. What it really means is that we have no way of knowing who is infected. So to really know, to base our decision making based on the reported numbers, when only 2% of the population represents the reported numbers, is strange to me. But what green means is that we can begin to have gathering while recognizing and utilizing the public health guidelines. So now you'll start to see cosmetology places, beauty shops, barber shops, nail salons opening up. You'll start to see stores that are currently now only offering curbside service opening their doors. Restaurants will start to open their doors. Places that we like to frequent all the time, places like Panera and Starbucks, and those places will start to open up, and you'll start to see changes in how they operate, in encouraging a cashless system of payment, still observing social distancing, still requiring wearing face coverings, having increased levels of hygiene and sanitation, either for their patrons or just procedurally that the staff have to now be hyper vigilant about. You'll see that parks are going to start to reopen. Here in Pennsylvania, one of the areas that Green has opened back up is youth organized sports. So that's another area because there are a lot of kids out there, baseball players, soccer players, who have not been able to practice and participate in their spring sports, softball, summer league basketball. But now we're going to start to see those things coming back as well under this green, new normal. I would just say that people need to be cognizant. Again, just because you can go out does not mean that you should necessarily just go back to how you were hanging out before COVID hit the scene. It just means that now you will find it a little bit more convenient to do the things that right now have been a little more cumbersome. So, now you can't get your hair, you couldn't get your hair cut at all. And now you need to get your hair cut, but you need to get your hair cut recognizing that, the entire barbershop clientele has been without a haircut for 14 weeks. And even when the barbershop was opening and functioning and moving on all four cylinders, if you went to the barbershop at 2 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, you're going to be sitting around with a lot of people waiting for a couple of hours. And so now that couple of hours might be 4 or 5 hours. And so, you've got to still use some good judgment, some common sense. Just because green is green doesn't mean that everything goes back to normal. I don't know that we're ever going to be back to pre-COVID normal. I think normal is going to look completely different, whether it be how we meet and gather, how many people are able to work at home. We still have no idea what school is going to look like. Everyone's talking about in the classroom, how are we going to get these kids on the bus? Forget about the school. We can't even get them. We got 30 kids on a school bus, so that's not going to be able to happen anymore. So that, I think, is more of a rate limiting driver than how the school is configured, because if we can't get these kids to school, then it doesn't really matter how you configure the building. So every aspect of our lives is going to be different. If kids now are going to have to go to school every other day, and you are a single parent breadwinner, and so right. How does that look in your household in September? If your child was already an IEP child, as one of my children is, meaning they have an individual educational plan that really works well when they spend time in the building, and now they're in the building only half the time, but their full grade depends upon their ability to function in an environment that they've never had to function in. What does that look like? Is it fair for that student to now be graded based on an educational environment that isn't any longer individualized? Individualized meant, that child had access to a resource teacher whenever they needed, in person, in the physical, and now that child has access to a resource teacher maybe once a week by Zoom, but yet their grade doesn't change. So how does that look? So there's so many aspects of this, even under green, that we haven't figured out, because we're not going to be able to do things the way we used to. And then I'd say one of the things I want to plant, not to try to create more panic and anxiety, because we are all stressed the heck out about COVID, is we all need to wrap our minds around two things. One, once we do begin to meet the testing threshold, the government still suggests that we need to be at a level of about 10 million tests per week in order to adequately identify the positive cases in the country. Well, if we assume that 10% of the number of people tested are positive, and that seems to be what the number hangs out around globally, that means that if we test 10 million people this week, that means 1 million new tests, positive tests, are going to hit the data. And no one has prepared the population for that number, because everybody's been telling the population, you need to look for the curve to flatten and the curve to start to move down. Well, as soon as we start adding 1 million new positive tests into any equation, we know what that curve is going to do. And even though that shouldn't be a cause for panic, if we haven't told people to prepare for that, it will be a cause for panic. We also need to prepare for the fact that, come fall, we may need to go back to yellow or even back to red. And what does that look like?
Right.
Just after we begin to settle back into this new normal, all of a sudden, COVID-19 and influenza do a double whammy on the population. And now all of a sudden, we're back to red. And, that decision could literally be overnight. You go to bed under green and you wake up under red. But we can begin to prepare our minds, prepare our finances, prepare our families for those things even now. On a nice, beautiful June 1st morning, it's hard to think that come November we could be back, sheltering in place and not able to do the things that green allows us to do. But how's the saying go? If those who fail to prepare to fail. And
Yeah.
so we need to begin to think about what the fall is going to look like, because there's a very good likelihood without a vaccine that we are going to see a shift in how we operate once fall and winter return. And if we don't prepare now, then a lot of people will be needlessly additionally stressed. I mean, it's going to be stressful. Don't get me wrong. When we start seeing hospitals back in all these personal protective equipment and COVID units reopening, and the news will jump right on that. But we could have prepared for it better. And churches the same way. The church needs to, as part of their plan to reopen, they need to include a plan to reclose, because the likelihood of having to reclose is high. I think the other thing I would like to say to people who are struggling right now from a faith perspective, many people grapple with this balance between medicine and science and their faith, and they believe that there's this hard stop, this fine line, or this really very well-defined line between the two. And if you're listening to a doctor, then you're not exercising your faith.
Right.
And many churches, that is not necessarily a maliciously intended message, but that's sometimes the message that gets conveyed. Bring your pills to the altar and leave them here if you really trust God. Well, God's going to tell you that you don't need to take your medicine before he tells somebody who's telling you to take your $300 bottle of pills and leave them at the altar. And so we can, God is a God of all knowledge, including science. He utilizes all people, whether they ascribe to our faith beliefs or not. If the best surgeon for the job is a Muslim, you best believe I'm going to use a Muslim surgeon.
Yes,
if it
sir.
means that I have the best chance of survival. And so, I'm encouraging people to understand that you do not have to leave your faith on the shelf when you are listening and following the instructions of science, nor do you have to feel like you can't engage in a faith conversation with someone who is a scientist or a physician. The two are intertwined into who you are. It's part of your fabric. And to leave one out of any of your decision making is setting you up to make decisions that may not be in your best interest. So absolutely seek God. But God is the God of the doctor and the medicine and the epidemiologist and all of this information. And so you don't want to be made to feel that if I'm listening to science, then I'm somehow failing my faith, because that is the farthest thing from the truth. So I hope that people are kind of taking this with a grain of salt. I'm not telling you to be disruptive in your church congregation, but I do think that you have a right as a congregant in the midst of any public health dilemma, especially a global pandemic, to ask some certain questions. And so, one of the questions, I break down the questions that the church needs to answer, and therefore these are the same questions that church folk can ask. They deal with people, process, and possibilities. So for example, with people, we need to know, how many people are we anticipating coming to our church? And that number, we kind of know, we know who comes and who doesn't. We can expect that perhaps a greater number may start to come, at least initially, because the storm has passed, and people are going to have some level of newfound faith, and so the church may be a little more full at the beginning, but we need to prepare for that. The average church in the United States, Christian church, only has about 75 people to begin with, but church congregations and church buildings tend to be small, so we need to account for that. We need to then also understand, well, what do we do if, say, our church opens and 2 or 3 other churches within our proximity stay closed? How do we manage the surge of people who may come to our church because we're the only church that's open? So if we did all this planning, and it took weeks and weeks to plan, and it should take weeks and weeks and weeks to plan, but let's say we plan for our regular folk, our 50, but then all of a sudden 100 more show up because 3 other churches stayed closed. And now what does that look like? Well, are we gonna cave in and just say, well, we're gonna trust God and just invite people in, and now people are sitting on top of each other? Well, we've seen what that's done in churches all over this country. Pastors are dying, congregants are getting sick, and then they take that sickness back to their homes, and then community members and their families get sick, and then they die. So we've got to have a plan that accounts for the people. We need to have a process. We're social, and we love to gather. Fellowship is one of the things that has kept our people together since they put us in the ship. Even in the slave ship, when we didn't speak the same language, over the course of a 1-month journey across the ocean, 2 people from different tribes learned how to have fellowship because they were chained together in a slave ship. So we are very communal people, but we're going to have to change our process. We're not going to be able to bump your neighbor and high five your neighbor, and we're not going to be able to extend the right hand of fellowship the way we used to. And churches are going to have to change that process and create a new normal. And what's that going to look like, and how are people going to respond emotionally, either out on the outside or on the inside, that some of the fellowship elements are going to look different? But also, just at a very basic level process, how are we going to get people into the sanctuary? How are we going to get people out of the sanctuary? And how are we going to prevent the stuff that, how it is between the vestibule, the church steps outside the door, and the fellowship hall? That's where we're going to gather before church and after church. But we're not going to be able to do that anymore. So we're going to have to figure out what that looks like. And so, and then, just kind of basic housekeeping process. How do we determine how to define what clean is now? What does that look like in the budget? Many church liability carriers are no longer going to permit just this kind of haphazard way of keeping the church space clean, because they're on the hook if someone gets sick and decides to sue the church. And church liability suits are one of the fastest growing areas in law in the country. So, what does that look like? Are you going to have to hire a professional company at certain intervals? And how is that going to look when it's beyond your budget to pay for it? So we talk about process and then possibility. So from the possibility standpoint, well, what does it look like if someone comes into your church and then lets say on Wednesday, after they've been in, let's not say this Wednesday, but let's say they came to church on May the 30th, and then on June the 10th, they notify the church that they have a positive test result. What does that look like? What's your burden as a church to now contact the 50 people who were in that building? How do you track them down? How do you advise them on what to do next? And now you will be forced to close your church for up to 14 days, and everyone in that building will be under quarantine. So what does that look like? And obviously, we have to be prepared for the possibility of having to reclose our church just because the data from the public health sector tells us that it's not safe to gather anymore. So So these are questions that churches need to wrestle with. No one church should have one person assigned to this decision making. It should be a group of trusted leaders that reads in the congregation at different intervals. There's a discussion, I'm sure, within churches. Do we take it to the church to vote on the decision? And the general consensus, I think, among church leaders is that that's for the individual church to decide. But if, for example, our church decided, if we use that framework and our church decided that they were going to want to open, then they would have to open without a pastor, because the pastor's not coming in and opening just because we're on green. So you run into challenges if you make these decisions in the vacuum of one, but you also run into problems if you try to encompass the entire number of people, because you're going to get so many different thought processes and opinions. So, but that's part of this conversation, because you have to have these discussions. And so whether you are part of the decision-making group or not, whether you are a church member or just someone who is still, maybe you were in the process of looking for a church to call home, you should be asking these questions of the leaders who are making those decisions, because that's going to give you the information to make an informed decision. The music is off the chain, the preaching is ridiculously powerful, but after church they gathering together, or they're letting 300 people in the space and we're literally sitting next to each other. Well, maybe I need to listen to that sermon online because I'm putting myself at risk. And at that point, knowing what I know, then that really risk is my risk. I can't blame that on the church. If I look around in my surroundings and I see that there are things that just don't make sense to me, but yet I still go in to the sanctuary, then that really becomes my issue. But if I don't ask the question ahead of time, then I might find myself stuck with an emotional decision. If I didn't ask, and then I show up on a Sunday and I've been all excited, I've been preparing all week for this first time back in the sanctuary, and I get there and now everybody's on top of everybody, but I'm here now, what's the likelihood that I'm gonna get back in my car and go home?
Right.
But if I prepare for it and I've asked the question and they haven't given me sufficient answer to put my mind at ease, then maybe I don't go at all, and I don't put myself in a position to have to make an emotional decision, and I'm making an informed decision. Most churches are not going to have to worry about that. I mean, at Emmanuel, we would love to have a full sanctuary every Sunday, and we're working towards that. But the reality right now is we have space to accommodate a certain number of people between the fellowship hall and the sanctuary. We're trying to figure out how are we going to space out people in the building and make sure that everybody maintains some safe social distance. And we're trying to figure out what it looks like when we reach that capacity. And heaven forbid we have to tell somebody, I'm sorry, we can't, let you in today. Especially since how we are. We also often attend church and come late. So
right.
Coming late doesn't mean you don't get in this new normal, because the seats are going to be allocated. And how does that look? Because, many, all of my kids play youth sports, and there are companies now that are recognizing that in youth sports, you've got these outdoor spaces, but now you're going to have to space out the spectators. And so now they're creating mechanisms for e-ticketing, where the ticket still doesn't cost anything, but each designated circle where you could put your lawn chair on the field is a designated ticket space. And there's now a way of saying, well, this field is this big and we can accommodate 30 spectators, and we're going to give out 30 e-tickets. And if you're number 31, then you just will have to watch from the car.
Wow.
So I don't know what that's going to look like in churches. Most churches are probably not going to have that level of sophistication, but these larger congregations are going to have to figure out how they're going to, no different than the Steelers. They're going to have to figure out how are we going to manage that. These season ticket holders are going to going to find out perhaps that, you know what, I'm only now allowed to go to half the games because, we're not going to have 65,000 people in Heinz Field anymore. We
Right.
may have 25,000. So, so the point is that people need to make these informed decisions. And I think those are some basic questions that they should be asking those who are making the decisions for their churches, not to be disruptive, but to be informed. Because if, as an informed individual, you're able to keep yourself and your family safe, and that's what this is really, really all about.
All right, that's part two of my interview with Reverend Dr. Chris Conti. We're going to come back and share parts 3, 4, and I think 5. Yes, we do have 5 segments of this. Really good information. I wanted to break it down because it was a lengthy interview. So much good information. I wanted you to get it. So please like this, share this, let somebody know. Pastor Chris Conti, Dr. Chris Conti has some great perspectives on how we should handle and plan for a return back to normal society.